Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. It was a Tuesday morning, unusually bright for early April, when Mildred White, the vicar's housemaid, managed to do what she had long feared but never quite committed. She broke something valuable while dusting the upper shelves of the rectory's drawing-room cabinet, a place seldom disturbed and even less often visited. Her elbow caught the edge of a delicate Wedgwood sugar bowl, balanced too near the edge. The bowl fell with a muted clink onto the rug, not shattering completely but splitting down the middle with a crisp, almost intentional fracture. Mildred winced, already imagining the disapproving look of Mrs. Calthorpe, the vicar's wife, who kept her few heirlooms less out of sentiment than of class pride. But as she knelt to gather the broken halves, her eye caught something that made her hesitate. Beneath the porcelain lining, where the glaze had cracked open like a lid, was something tucked inside, something impossibly dry and folded too precisely to be accidental. It was a note, a small square of yellowing paper, folded twice, creased by age but sharp in intent. Mildred glanced over her shoulder, then opened it. In a spidery, faded hand it read, "The child must never know. If she finds the truth in the orchard, it's the end." She stood frozen for a moment. The orchard. The Merton place had one, didn't it? Everyone knew it had been unoccupied since old Mrs. Merton died 5 years ago. The bowl, yes, it had once been hers, passed down to the rectory when her belongings were quietly cleared. The paper trembled between Mildred's fingers. She wasn't a clever girl by any measure, but even she could tell this wasn't a mere grocery list or a misplaced invitation. This was the sort of note that belonged in a different world entirely. The kind of world whispered about during long tea breaks and knitted over during quiet evenings. Later that day, while polishing the silver, she told herself she would say nothing. But secrets, like sherry and scandal, rarely stayed bottled for long and much dithering. Mildred lasted precisely 2 days. By Thursday afternoon, while helping arrange hymnals at the church hall, she recounted her find, half proudly, half nervously, to Mrs. Bantry. It was done in the manner of those who pretend they are unsure whether to share something, but have, in truth, rehearsed every word of the telling. Mrs. Bantry, who had a lifelong affection for both mysteries and melodrama, responded with gratifying alarm. She pressed for details, the handwriting, the mention of the orchard, the unmistakable whiff of secrecy. When she heard the sugar bowl had belonged to Mrs. Merton, her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of narrative alignment. "You must show it to Miss Marple," she said at once, already half out of her chair. "I don't know if I ought," Mildred began. "Nonsense, dear. If anyone can make sense of such a thing, it's Jane." And so the note, tucked again in its brittle folds, was handed into the quiet, gloved fingers of Miss Marple the very next morning. Miss Marple read it without comment at first, peering over the rim of her spectacles as though consulting a familiar recipe. Her fingers were still slightly dusted with flour from the morning sponge cake preparations, but her mind, as always, was thoroughly attentive. "A curious place to conceal something," she murmured after the silence had grown just long enough to stretch. Mildred looked down. "The sugar bowl," Miss Marple continued half to herself, "an object of pure domesticity, not likely to be opened, and even less likely to be questioned. Unless broken, of course. Accidental truth, you might say." The housemaid blinked, unsure whether she was being congratulated or chastised. "Tell me," Miss Marple asked gently, "had Mrs. Merton any children?" "Not that I ever heard. She kept to herself mostly." Miss Marple folded the note once more, her eyes already distant. "Yes, she always did." In the quiet parlor of her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Bantry, the latter animated by a sense of occasion, only half contained beneath a respectable hat. The teacups between them steamed faintly, though neither had touched theirs in several minutes. "I've always thought there was something odd about that woman," Mrs. Bantry was saying. "Lived like a widow though she never married. Spoke to no one except that odd man who handled her affairs. Harold something." "Fenchurch," Miss Marple supplied, eyes still on the note. Yes, that's the one. Harold Fenchurch. Kept himself tucked away in that big house. Some said he was her cousin. Others thought he wasn't anything at all. But still, when she died, so suddenly, mind you, it was he who dealt with the will. Miss Marple placed the note gently on her saucer. "It strikes me," she said softly, "that Mrs. Merton was a woman who went to great lengths to maintain privacy, and such women often keep not one but several secrets, each layered more carefully than the last. But the orchard, what could possibly have happened there?" Miss Marple gave a small quiet smile, the kind she reserved for the moment just before knitting together a particularly tangled skein. "There are things," she said, "that do not belong in orchards. Dolls, for example, or silence. One must always question silence." Mrs. Bantry looked at her sharply. "You've been to the orchard?" "I took a walk there yesterday evening. Nothing unusual, save a rather weather-worn doll's head, half buried beneath an old apple tree." "Good heavens!" "Indeed." She poured herself a second cup of tea, then paused to add just the right amount of milk. "Secrets have a way of ripening, Dolly. Much like fruit, and when left unattended, they fall." There was a quiet shift in the social temperature of much dithering when one overcast morning the name Clara Fenwick appeared in the vicar's visitor's book. It was Mrs. Bantry, of course, who noted it first. No one quite knew how she came upon such details so swiftly, but her methods, though mysterious, were rarely inaccurate. A lady from London, she had said. Very quiet, terribly pale, no family spoken of, and staying at the Merton Lodge. That last detail alone was enough to stir every tongue from the post office queue to the grocer scale. Merton Lodge had stood empty since Mrs. Merton's passing, its shutters drawn, its orchard overgrown, its presence a silent monument to a woman who had shared little of herself in life or legacy. That it had now been let, even temporarily, and to someone with the same surname as Mrs. Merton's long-forgotten cousin's wife, was more than coincidence to those who had made curiosity their daily bread. Miss Marple, for her part, reserved her judgment. She had learnt long ago that newcomers brought more than suitcases. They carried questions, stories, and, on occasion, the solutions to puzzles once thought unsolvable. The name Fenwick was not unfamiliar to her, though it took her a moment to place it. Somewhere in the vague peripheries of village chatter, it had belonged to someone once connected, however faintly, to the Merton household. But time had a way of softening such details into suggestion. Clara herself appeared to invite neither attention nor conversation. She wore gloves even in warmth, spoke in short, precise sentences, and carried the air of someone expecting disapproval, but hoping for neutrality. When asked about her intentions for the property, She had simply replied that she was considering a purchase, pending some family documentation. The phrase was enough to excite the speculations of those who fancied themselves guardians of village memory. She has the look of someone returning, not arriving, Miss Marple said quietly, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, her eyes thoughtful. And what do you suppose she's returning to? Her friend asked. Miss Marple stirred her tea once, lightly, before replying. Perhaps not what? Perhaps why? As word of Clara Fenwick's presence settled into the village's bloodstream, conversation inevitably turned to the matter of inheritance. The Merton estate, though modest by the standards of landed gentry, had long carried with it a quiet dignity, a dignity maintained more by secrecy than splendor. It was common knowledge that Mrs. Merton's affairs had been managed, both before and after her death, by one Harold Fenchurch, a cousin whose precise relationship was never convincingly confirmed. Harold had been the sort of man who moved with caution and vanished with ease. His appearances in much dithering were infrequent and uninspiring, marked by dark suits, tight-lipped expressions, and a fastidious manner that invited neither friendliness nor suspicion. He had handled Mrs. Merton's will with swift discretion, and as far as anyone could recall, had never spoken of its contents to another soul. This discretion, once deemed commendable, now assumed a more ambiguous hue. For why had the estate been left to drift into silence and overgrowth, rather than passed to a rightful heir, if such an heir existed? Clara's arrival had reopened questions long shelved but not forgotten. Some villagers recalled that Mrs. Merton had once referred to a companion's child who lived with her briefly in the early 1930s. Others believed that child to be a niece or ward, though no name was ever spoken, and no trace remained. What was certain, however, was that Merton Lodge had never been a home of laughter. It was a place of whispers, of doors closed quietly, and of fruit left to spoil in the orchard after a sudden summer departure. Miss Marple, listening to all this from her place in the tea-room, nodded politely as she always did, but her mind turned not to the will itself, but to the act of handling it. Wills were not simply documents. They were the culmination of choices, some made in life, others made just before death. And in a village such as much dithering, where few things stayed buried and fewer remained forgotten, the identity of the person who bore responsibility was often as telling as the contents of the will itself. It was at this moment that she decided Harold Fenchurch required a closer look, not because of what he had done, but perhaps because of what he had chosen not to do. Miss Marple believed quite firmly in the revealing power of small talk. It was in the seemingly inconsequential, the placement of a spoon, the glance that lingered too long, the tone too even for comfort, that truths often revealed themselves. And so, when she invited Clara Fenwick for tea, she did so not with interrogation in mind, but observation. Clara accepted the invitation with a hesitance masked in politeness. She dressed plainly, answered questions with measured brevity, and offered neither complaint nor curiosity. They spoke of roses and rainfall, of the village fete, and the unpredictability of marmalade batches. But Miss Marple, as ever, was not interested in the surface of the conversation. She was watching Clara's hands. They trembled only once, when the topic, innocently broached, turned to village heirlooms. There was that sugar bowl, Miss Marple remarked, lifting her own. A pretty thing, quite old, once belonged to Mrs. Merton. A pity it broke. Clara's teacup met the saucer with the faintest clink, the sound barely audible, but unmistakable to a mind trained to detect dissonance. She did not comment, only smiled faintly and asked about the vicar's garden. Later, as the two women stood at the doorway, Clara paused. "You said it belonged to Mrs. Merton." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "One of her finer pieces, I'm told, though apparently it had secrets of its own." Clara offered a courteous smile, but her eyes had darkened slightly, as if something long dismissed had returned, not with answers, but with questions. Miss Marple watched her descend the path, shoulders held too stiffly, steps too quick. Inside, she poured herself a second cup. It was, she thought, not the sugar bowl itself that mattered, but the reaction to it. And that, in her experience, was more telling than any document or confession. The village of Much Dithering awoke one morning to news that carried the chill of winter into the heart of spring. Harold Fenchurch, the enigmatic and reclusive cousin once entrusted with the affairs of the late Mrs. Merton, had been found dead in his study. The discovery was made by his manservant, who had grown concerned when the master did not ring for breakfast. The room was locked from within, the window bolted shut, the pistol resting loosely in Harold's right hand, and a single sheet of paper folded carefully on the desk beside him. The note, such as it was, bore no greeting, no signature, only 6 words, each penned with a shaky precision. "I cannot bear the orchard lie." The implication was clear enough to the local constable, who, after a short inquiry and in consultation with the coroner, ruled the matter a suicide. It was a tidy conclusion, too tidy, in Miss Marple's estimation. She had long since learned that neatness, though socially admirable, was rarely a companion of truth. Harold's death cast a long and peculiar shadow. It was not only the abruptness of the act that unsettled the village, but the cryptic nature of the words he had chosen. What did he mean by the orchard lie? Was it a metaphor, a private torment, or a literal confession of some hidden past? Clara Fenwick, when informed, was visibly shaken, though Miss Marple observed that her first question was not how he had died, but rather when. A curious detail, one easily overlooked by those focused on the mechanics of the event, but not by Miss Marple, for whom timelines were often as revealing as testimonies. The vicar, in an unusually reflective moment, confided to Miss Marple that Harold had once spoken of a burden too large to name. He said, the vicar recalled, that he was safeguarding a truth too heavy for daylight. Such remarks, easily dismissed during life as the private musings of a melancholy bachelor, now returned with weight. Harold had held something close, perhaps for decades, and died rather than speak it. And yet, despite this silence, Miss Marple suspected the truth had already begun to surface. In broken china, in the tremor of a teacup, in the orchard soil that had not yet yielded its final secret. In the days that followed Harold Fenchurch's death, the village resumed its daily rhythms, though with a quiet unease that lingered like mist over a still pond. Much Dithering was no stranger to misfortune, but this was different. This was not an accident, nor a passing illness. This was a decision, deliberate and damning, by a man who had kept his distance even in life. Miss Marple, whose social standing allowed her entrance into houses others merely speculated about, visited Harold's study under the pretext of assisting with the sorting of papers. The late Mr. Fenchurch had left no close kin, and the solicitor appointed to manage his estate was both grateful and relieved to accept help from a woman known for her quiet competence. The room itself reflected its occupant, austere, well-ordered, unwelcoming. The papers were arranged in careful piles, ledgers balanced, correspondence neatly tied. But amidst the precision, Miss Marple's eye caught a discordant detail. The family albums, those traditional volumes of black pages and sepia memories, had been placed not in sequence, as one might expect, but with one missing. Volumes 1 through 5 sat in a row, followed by Volume 7. Volume 6 was nowhere to be found. It was a minor irregularity, certainly not enough to trouble the average person. But to Miss Marple, who had once solved a minor inheritance dispute based on the order of a lady's sewing threads, the absence was conspicuous. Furthermore, the photographs in the remaining albums had been annotated with fastidious care. Names, dates, events, all recorded in the same neat hand. Yet one image in Volume 5, depicting a woman with a child seated beneath what appeared to be an apple tree, bore no label at all. The woman resembled Mrs. Merton. The child, though partially turned, had a face strikingly similar to Clara Fenwick. It was then that Miss Marple began to suspect that Harold Fenchurch's true role in the Merton household had been more than administrative. He had been a steward not only of the estate, but of its secrets. His death had been mourned, yes, but also accepted with a swiftness that hinted at communal relief. The dead cannot speak, but their omissions, Miss Marple reflected, often speak for them. And so she made a note to inquire not only about the missing album, but also about the orchard. Again, some truths, once buried, do not stay at rest. The quiet that followed Harold's funeral was more practical than reverent. His affairs, though substantial, were well organized. His house was to be sold, his personal belongings divided among distant relations, and his passing noted only with polite regret by the local paper. Yet for all the outward signs of closure, the something stubbornly refused to fade. It began with an offhand remark from Miss Finch, the retired schoolmistress, who had wandered into the post office to inquire whether the telegraph boy still delivered on Sundays. Upon overhearing a discussion about Harold's death, she had said, almost absently, "I always wondered what became of that Edith Grace girl. Strange child. Never quite right after the orchard." The remark, made without emphasis or follow-up, caught Miss Marple's attention with the sharpness of a pinprick. Edith Grace, a name not mentioned in decades. And yet, there it was, linked not to Harold, nor to Mrs. Merton, but to the orchard once more. A few discreet inquiries followed. Records were examined, timelines compared. And then, in a stack of miscellaneous papers that had not yet been reviewed by the solicitor's clerk, Miss Marple found something curious. A school report card, issued in 1933, for one Edith Grace. The card bore the emblem of a girls' academy in Sussex, and included notes on arithmetic, composition, and deportment. But what struck Miss Marple most was the age, 14, and the suddenness with which the report ceased. No certificate of departure, no record of transfer, just silence. She turned the card over. On the back, faint pencil marks had once indicated an address, hastily erased. But under angled light, part of a word reappeared. Orchard Gate. It was enough to turn suspicion into purpose. Miss Marple had long believed that what people chose to conceal said more about them than what they revealed. And now, the threads began to align. An orphaned girl with no departure record, a sugar ball with a hidden message, and a man whose guilt could no longer be borne. There remained one question that pressed harder than the rest. Was Clara Fenwick the key to this puzzle, or part of the pattern it was designed to hide? Miss Marple had always believed that records, like people, could disappear not only through error or oversight, but through intent. The school report card bearing the name Edith Grace lingered in her thoughts with increasing insistence. It was not merely the sudden stop in her academic record that troubled her, nor the faint pencil smudge on the reverse that seemed to whisper, "Orchard Gate." It was the air of incompletion, of a life that had simply ceased without ceremony. Her inquiries, modest in appearance yet precise in effect, soon led her to the remains of school archives in Sussex. A former headmistress, long retired and of advancing age, had retained some recollection of the name. "Quiet child," she said vaguely, "not one for drawing attention. Left us. Goodness, was it 30 years ago? Something about her family illness. Or perhaps she simply stopped attending. Such things happened, you know." But Miss Marple knew better. Children did not vanish from respectable girls' schools without reason, and the term "Orchard Gate," resurfacing from the faded script on the card, was no coincidence. Further inquiries among parish registers, hospital admissions, and burial records yielded nothing. There was no Edith Grace buried in the county, no marriage listed, no emigration recorded. It was as if the girl had simply ceased to exist sometime in the spring of 1933, at precisely the age of 14. Miss Marple considered the date carefully. 14 was a pivotal age, old enough to understand secrets, young enough to be dismissed. If Edith had indeed been connected to Mrs. Merton, as Miss Marple increasingly suspected, she would have been a liability to someone whose life had been shrouded in social propriety and quiet disgrace. And then there was the orchard, the setting repeatedly linked with both danger and concealment. The note in the sugar bowl had warned that the child must never know. But what, precisely, had she not been meant to discover? And what happened when she did? Miss Marple pressed the school report flat upon her writing desk and studied it for several long minutes. Not the content which she had already memorized, but the paper itself. A worn crease, just so. A smudge, half erased. And then an impression, barely there, of another hand that had handled the document with trembling purpose. It was becoming clear now that Edith Grace had not merely vanished, she had been removed. In the drawing rooms, post office queues, and church flower rotors of much dithering, memory worked in subtle, often contradictory ways. People forgot birthdays, but not weddings. They misplaced the faces of visiting nephews, but remembered exactly what a neighbor wore to a funeral in 1927. So it was with Edith Grace, when Miss Marple began to ask, gently, unobtrusively, about the girl who had once been known as Mrs. Merton's companion's child. The responses were vague but telling. "Oh, yes," murmured Mrs. Maplethorpe, who had served at the Merton Lodge for a season. "There was a child, now you mention it. Pale thing, hair the color of straw left too long in the rain. Didn't speak much, liked to walk alone in the orchard." Others remembered the girl too, though few could agree on her origin. Some claimed she was the daughter of a cousin fallen on hard times. Others swore she was the ward of a school friend, taken in out of charity. No one had ever seen her parents, and none could recall her surname without prompting. But they remembered her eyes, striking, dark-lashed, and uncommonly solemn for a child. "A bit like Clara's," someone muttered once, not quite meaning to. Miss Marple took particular note of that remark. Clara Fenwick had the same watchful silence, the same tendency to withdraw at moments of emotional intensity, She had spoken little of her childhood, except to say that she had been raised by a distant aunt who died when she was 16, after which she had found employment in London. She bore no resemblance to Mrs. Merton, none that would have drawn attention, but the likeness to the child in the photograph had not escaped Miss Marple's notice. If Edith Grace had grown and borne a child in secret, concealed by shame, fear, or necessity, it would explain much. It would explain Clara's confusion about her origins, her unease when confronted with the sugar bowl, and the strange weight she carried without knowing why. Yet the truth, as ever, remained obscured by time and manners. People in the village spoke only what was safe to speak, thought only what was acceptable to think. It would take more than gossip to penetrate the veil Mrs. Merton had so carefully drawn. And Miss Marple had no intention of stopping with gossip. There were many things Miss Marple had learned to observe with quiet precision. Window ledges recently dusted, shoes worn thin on the inside edge, teaspoons placed slightly out of line in a drawer. But none offered quite the insight as the portraits of family homes. Pictures spoke in their own way, and what they said was rarely what they were meant to. It was under the pretense of returning a borrowed linen inventory that Miss Marple found herself once more within the parlor of Merton Lodge. Clara, though polite, seemed increasingly distracted. Her manner had grown tense, the serenity of her early arrival replaced by something more fractured, more haunted. She had taken to walking in the orchard alone, though she never stayed long, and always returned pale. On this visit, Miss Marple let her gaze wander to the far wall, where portraits still hung in neat, deliberate symmetry. Most were of the Merton line, stern-jawed gentlemen and high-bosomed ladies, the sort who looked as though they disapproved of anything younger than 70. One, however, differed. It was a portrait of a young woman, late 30s perhaps, seated with a child at her feet. The woman's expression was distant, almost blurred, while the child looked up with strikingly vivid eyes. It was this last detail that caught Miss Marple's attention, for something about the child's face was not quite right. Later, as Clara left the room to fetch the borrowed linens, Miss Marple approached the painting. There was a slight gleam across the surface, a patch not dulled by time. She leaned closer, careful not to touch. Yes, the eyes had been altered. The paint was newer, applied with a finer brush, and the layering uneven. Someone had repainted the child's eyes, but why? Only one answer presented itself with any logic, to obscure the resemblance. Whether to the mother or the daughter, Miss Marple could not yet say, but it had been done deliberately, and likely by someone who wished to erase the link between the present and a dangerous past. When Clara returned, Miss Marple remarked on the painting's odd composition. Clara looked at it, then away. "I never liked it," she said softly. "There's something in it that doesn't belong." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "Often the things that do not belong are the very ones that tell us the truth." As she took her leave, the portrait stayed with her. A mother, a child. A set of eyes changed to protect or condemn, and beneath it all, the slow rising tide of a truth long buried and now, perhaps, beginning to stir. The next morning a letter arrived at the vicarage, anonymous, uneven handwriting, a single sentence. "You were right to look in the sugar bowl, but be careful. The truth kills." It was in the nature of Miss Marple to let things unfold quietly, as one would coax a particularly shy cat from beneath a hedge. But there were times, rare and never without deliberation, when she acted with purposeful haste. The letter, unsigned and cryptic, had changed her tempo. She did not believe in melodrama, nor in anonymous threats, but she did believe in the orchard. Late that afternoon, under the guise of inspecting the grounds for the parish fete, Miss Marple made her way to the overgrown corner of the Merton orchard, just beyond the third row of gnarled apple trees. The ground there, she remembered, had long held a strange, uneven quality, as if it had once been disturbed and then too quickly forgotten. She did not bring a spade herself, of course. That would have been most unseemly. But she had a quiet word with Mr. Briggs, the retired railway porter who now tended gardens in his leisure, and owed Miss Marple several kindnesses of a legal and botanical nature. He required no explanation, only a location, and her assurance that his discretion would remain unchallenged. The soil gave way with surprising ease, crumbling beneath the spade, with the softness of long-settled secrecy. Only a foot or two down, the blade struck something that was not stone. Something wrapped. The bundle withdrawn with care was wrapped in stiffened oilcloth, its folds discolored by damp and time. Miss Marple's hands, though trembling slightly, moved with deliberate calm. The cloth was opened. Within lay 3 items: a faded piece of muslin cloth, stained in one corner by something dark and rust-colored, a child's sandal, cracked with age and the brittleness of disuse, and a locket, tarnished, closed, yet still gleaming faintly in the weak sunlight. Miss Marple did not speak, but she breathed slowly through her nose, eyes fixed on the objects before her. There was something mournful about the way the sandal rested against the cloth, as though remembering a foot that had once danced and later run in fear. The locket she took last, gently. It was heavy in a way that spoke of sentiment, not metal. It had been buried for decades, and yet, she thought, its contents had likely never faded, because memories, when sealed by guilt, were made not to vanish, but to wait. The locket, when opened, revealed 2 photographs, tarnished, pressed behind thin glass, and delicately poised to offer just enough, without saying too much. On the left, unmistakably, was Mrs. Merton, in younger years, her expression neither warm nor cold, but composed, as though she were posing for something obligatory, rather than sentimental. She wore a brooch with an iris-shaped clasp, long thought to have been lost during the war. The right-hand side bore the image of a child, perhaps no more than 1 year old. The infant's face was round and solemn, with an expression too still for its age. Not Edith Grace, that much was immediately clear. The child's hair was lighter, and the eyes lacked that unmistakable depth Miss Marple had noted in the repainted portrait. And yet, there was something, an echo of someone, buried in the lines of the mouth, the brow, the cheekbones. Who the child was remained uncertain, but that it had mattered deeply to Mrs. Merton was undeniable. No one buried something of such intimacy unless it bore the weight of guilt or the necessity of concealment. Miss Marple sat for a moment beneath the tree, the locket resting on her gloved palm. She reflected, not for the first time, on the nature of memory, how it distorted, protected, erased. The child in the photograph had been hidden not by time but by decision. The cloth, when examined, appeared to have once been part of a child's dress or nightgown, delicately embroidered, now torn at the hem. The bloodstain, though long dried and darkened, carried a truth of its own. Something had happened. Not an accident, Miss Marple sensed, but an event, an incident tied to silence, to hurried burials, and incomplete records. It was then that she recalled something curious. During the early stages of Mrs. Merton's reclusive period, She had once spoken at a ladies' garden tea of a season of sorrow that had followed her withdrawal from society. No one had thought to ask what sorrow she meant. The orchard, the sugar bowl, the repainted eyes, and now this buried bundle. Each piece pointed not to a single tragedy, but to a carefully managed erasure. And the child, unnamed in records and unspoken in memory, had been central to it all. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to speak again with Clara Fenwick, not to accuse, but to understand. When Clara Fenwick arrived at Miss Marple's cottage 2 days later, she appeared worn in a way that no rest could mend. There were lines beneath her eyes. Her posture carried a new brittleness, and though her manner was still polite, it had lost its early composure. She had received a letter, unsigned, unsettling, delivered without explanation. It had contained only a photograph, Mrs. Merton holding the same infant now revealed in the locket, and a single line typed beneath. "Is this where you began?" Clara, in her own halting way, began to speak. She had never known her father's name. Her mother, Estelle Fenwick, had died when Clara was 16. Estelle had always been evasive when asked about the past, insisting only that Clara had been born in safety, far from shame, and that nothing good came from unearthing old names. But Clara had always sensed the lie beneath the lullaby. There were no photographs from her early years, only one of her at about 3, and even that bore the faintly staged air of erasure. Her mother had wept once, after a fit of fever, murmuring something about the orchard and Edith's child. Clara had never dared ask for more. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Her gaze remained steady, her hands gently folded. She saw now the arc taking shape, not in neat lines but in human frailty. Clara was not Edith Grace, but perhaps Edith's daughter, or, if not her daughter, then the child in the locket, the infant once held by Mrs. Merton, then hidden, named afresh, and sent away to be forgotten. And if that were so, then Harold Fenchurch's death, the message in the sugar bowl, and the orchard burial were not disparate puzzles. They were parts of the same design. Edith Grace, perhaps discovering the truth of her child's intended fate, had threatened exposure. The orchard, which had once echoed with the laughter of a girl in her final year of childhood, had witnessed instead the closing of a life deemed inconvenient. Mrs. Merton, once the figure of spinsterish propriety, had harbored not only a child but a scandal, an illegitimate birth, a violent silencing, and a desperate cover-up. Harold, complicit or horrified, had maintained the lie, and then been haunted by it. Clara, raised among shadows, had unknowingly returned to the place where her life had been rewritten. Miss Marple did not offer comfort. That was not her way. But she did place the locket gently into Clara's hand. "Sometimes," she said, her voice almost inaudible, "what we are told we must never know is the very thing that sets us free." As Clara turned the locket over in her hand, the clasp caught the light, just enough to glint like the first crack in a long-sealed truth. There was something rather theatrical, though not intentionally so, about the way Miss Marple arranged the chairs in the Merton Lodge drawing-room. Each seat, though modestly chosen, had a view of the scented table, where tea was served with understated elegance, and a single plate of currant biscuits precisely placed. Miss Marple believed that order calmed the nerves, and nerves, on this particular afternoon, would need steadying. Those present included Clara Fenwick, whose expression betrayed quiet dread behind her composed features. Mrs. Bantry, still delighting in the novelty of secrets coming to light. The vicar and his wife, whose presence gave an air of official propriety. And importantly, Mr. Pettigrew, cousin to Mrs. Bantry, and one of the few surviving acquaintances of the late Mrs. Merton's earlier years. Miss Marple herself remained seated, knitting laid to one side, her voice measured but clear. This was not a confrontation, nor an accusation. It was, as she had once explained to the Colonel, simply the laying out of facts for those with sufficient courtesy to listen. She began with the sugar bowl. Its concealment, she remarked, had been a master stroke of domestic deception, hidden in plain sight, nestled among the familiar, and rendered untouchable by social reverence. From there she proceeded gently but precisely. The note, the orchard, the doll's head, the buried bundle. Each revelation was offered not for reaction, but for recognition. Miss Marple's gaze never lingered on any one face too long, but she saw everything. The tightening of Clara's hands, the slight shift in Pettigrew's posture, the flicker in the vicar's eyes when the name Edith Grace was spoken. It was not until the mention of the locket and the child whose image lay within that the air in the room shifted. Silence lengthened. A single clock ticked. "There are moments," Miss Marple said softly, "when the past no longer consents to remain buried. And when that happens, it is not scandal that emerges, but justice. Quiet, inconvenient, but always steady." No one spoke, and yet in the hush that followed, something old and long resisted began to loosen. What came next would unravel what generations of discretion had tried so hard to bind. Miss Marple, whose understanding of human nature had been earned not by proximity to violence, but through careful study of tea-room confessions and nursery gossip, now turned her attention to the heart of the matter. Edith Grace, she explained, had never been a companion's child, nor the orphaned ward of distant relatives. She was the daughter, unacknowledged and unrecorded, of Mrs. Merton herself, a product of a liaison with a certain Mr. Lionel Marchmont, whose name had once fluttered through society columns before being hushed by an advantageous marriage elsewhere. Mrs. Merton, having neither the courage to defy convention nor the inclination to forfeit her position, had borne the child in secret, arranging for her early years to be spent under another name. Edith was raised quietly, taught to keep her head down, and brought to the Merton Lodge when old enough to understand what was expected of her: obedience, invisibility, silence. But children, as Miss Marple remarked gently, are rarely quite so pliable as adults hope. Edith had questions, suspicions, and, most dangerous of all, a fierce sense of injustice. When she uncovered part of the truth, she became, in her mother's eyes, a liability, and in a world governed by shame, the elimination of risk often masqueraded as necessity. Miss Marple paused only briefly before continuing. Harold Fenchurch had been the custodian of Mrs. Merton's secrets. He had ensured that Edith's records vanished, that the orchard bore no trace of incident, and that the sugar bowl, last of Mrs. Merton's keepsakes, carried the warning she dared not speak aloud. But time wears thin even the most durable guilt. Harold had grown tired of silence and fearful of what Clara's presence might reawaken. As she spoke, Clara sat motionless, her face unreadable. And yet the truth now echoed between them all. Clara Fenwick was not merely a distant relative or accidental heir. She was the granddaughter of Mrs. Merton, born of Edith, whose life had been silenced, and whose child had been sent away under a borrowed name. It was not merely a question of inheritance Miss Marple observed. But of restoration. The truth had waited long enough. And now, at last, it had found a voice. Once the silence had settled, Miss Marple spoke again, calmly, gently, and without the least trace of theatricality. For her, the moment of revelation was not for performance, but for clarity. The truth, she believed, should arrive like a well-brewed pot of tea, warm, precise, and without bitterness. Harold Fenchurch, she explained, had not been merely a facilitator of legal affairs. He had been the instrument by which the past was concealed. It was he who had erased Edith Grace from official records, who had destroyed the 6th volume of the Merton family albums, and who had arranged the narrative of Edith's supposed departure abroad. Each act was undertaken not from cruelty, but from a misguided sense of protection, of Mrs. Merton, of the Merton name, and perhaps, in some quiet recess of conscience, of Clara herself. Yet even the most meticulous deception carries its fault lines. The sugar bowl, once sealed and stored away, had held more than porcelain. It had held the final echo of a dying woman's guilt. The note within, vague yet unmistakable, had been meant for someone who might one day stumble upon the orchard's secret. Harold had placed it there not to incriminate, but to ensure, if all else failed, that someone would come to know what he could not bear to tell. In time the burden became too great. Clara's arrival, so sudden and so startling in resemblance to the child who had vanished, had reopened the wound Harold had tried to dress in silence. He had not taken his life in a moment of cowardice, but in the steady collapse of a life lived in omission. The forged story had frayed at its seams, and the orchard, though long undisturbed, had begun to speak. Miss Marple rested her hands on her lap. "It was not a murder of malice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but of maintenance, of a lie that grew too large to carry. And yet," she added, "Harold had not acted alone. There was another, one whose presence had remained until now, in the shadows." Miss Marple turned her gaze, slowly, and without malice, towards Mr. Pettigrew. He, who had thus far maintained the composed air of a gentleman, mildly inconvenienced by proceedings, shifted in his chair. The gesture was small, an adjustment of posture, a flick at his cuff. But in Miss Marple's eyes it was enough. She began, as she so often did, not with accusation but with observation. Mr. Pettigrew, a cousin of Mrs. Bantry, and frequent visitor to much dithering, had a long-standing if unofficial connection to Mrs. Merton. In their youth he had courted her, or attempted to. The courtship had ended not in scandal but in quiet disappearance. What many failed to recall, or chose not to mention, was that shortly after the end of their acquaintance, Mrs. Merton had vanished for several months, returning thinner, colder, and more reserved. It was a matter of record that Mr. Pettigrew had later made advantageous investments, acquiring shares in the very firm that had managed the Merton estate's assets. His influence had grown not just in wealth, but in subtle authority. He had become, in effect, a quiet custodian of the family's affairs, appearing only when the waters were troubled. Miss Marple reminded those present that Harold Fenchurch had not acted impulsively. His records were pristine, his systems exacting. And yet, after Clara's arrival, he had been seen burning papers, something entirely out of character for a man who indexed even his gardening invoices. Why, she asked, would Harold do such a thing? Because, she answered herself, someone had threatened him, not with exposure but with revelation. Someone who knew about, Edith Grace. Someone who knew about the orchard. Someone who had once stood to lose everything if the truth emerged, and now saw opportunity in Clara's confusion and the estate's uncertain future. Mr. Pettigrew had hoped to buy Merton large after Clara sold it. He had offered quietly, subtly, through a third party. And when Harold hesitated, he reminded him of what lay buried and what would happen should others come digging. The suicide, Miss Marple revealed, was no longer certain. The locked study, the note, the pistol, all plausible. But there was one detail that no one had questioned: the ink on the note. It did not match the pen on Harold's desk. It matched instead the fountain pen Mr. Pettigrew had been known to carry, one with a unique violet tinge, imported from Belgium, a gift from a late sister. Mr. Pettigrew remained silent. It was a clever act, Miss Marple conceded. Not a murder in the traditional sense, but a psychological maneuver, a final push upon a man already standing at the edge. It was not the weapon that killed Harold, but the knowledge that everything he had protected was about to crumble, and that he would be the one blamed when it did. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. "In the end," she said, "truth does not punish the wicked. It simply refuses to remain forgotten." There was a long pause. Then Clara, quiet until now, asked in a voice barely audible, "And what became of Edith?" Miss Marple looked out toward the orchard. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but sure. "That, my dear, is the last piece of the story we must uncover." It was a quiet morning, soft with the promise of late spring, when Clara Fenwick returned once more to the orchard, not to uncover, nor to investigate, but simply to walk. Miss Marple had asked if she might accompany her, and Clara had agreed, though neither of them spoke as they passed beneath the old iron gate. The orchard had changed little over the years. Apple trees heavy with blossom, the undergrowth left to wonder, and the faint rustle of bees moving busily among the brambles. They walked slowly. Clara's hands were clasped behind her back, her gaze lowered, though not, Miss Marple noticed, in shame or confusion. Rather, she seemed to be absorbing something too vast for words, some invisible truth that reached through the earth and touched her gently on the shoulder. They stopped at the place where the bundle had been found, the soil now smoothed, a sapling planted nearby. Clara looked at it for a long time, and then, without prompting, turned to Miss Marple. "I would like to know," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "It is not easy," she replied quietly, "but truth rarely is." And so, with the soft rustling of the trees above them, Miss Marple told her what she had pieced together, what she had uncovered, and what she had surmised with the quiet clarity that so often escaped others. She spoke of Edith Grace, Clara's mother, born in secrecy and raised in silence, and of the tragic confrontation that had taken place years ago, between a daughter who dared to speak the truth and a mother who had no words left to defend herself. It had not been murder in the classic sense. Edith had not been struck or smothered or poisoned. She had run, perhaps frightened, perhaps desperate to escape. And in the orchard on a damp April afternoon, she had fallen. A branch, slick with rain, a stone, unseen. The blow to her head had not killed her immediately, but it had been enough. Mrs. Merton, in shock, had hidden the body, burying not just her daughter, but the consequence of her own failure. Clara listened without interruption. She did not weep. Instead, she stood very still, and then, after a time, knelt to touch the base of the sapling, growing in the place where her mother had died. She tried. Clara said at last, even if she couldn't finish. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, as one gardener might to another, offering comfort not in sentiment, but in shared understanding of things lost and tended too late. Back at St. Mary Mead, in the small but enviably ordered garden behind her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her usual morning ritual, the tending of her roses. They were not showy things, nothing too vulgar in color or unruly in shape, but they had been cultivated with patient hands and subtle attention. There was something deeply comforting, she had always believed, about the way gardens responded to care. They bore no grudges. They revealed what was planted, and if neglected, they told you so. As she trimmed a pale pink climber along the trellis, she considered the events of the past weeks. So many lives, intertwined by silence, shame, and obligation, had been drawn together by the smallest of objects, a sugar ball. Not a diary, nor a letter, nor even a key. Just a common household article, placed among dozens of others, its significance invisible until shattered by accident. How curious, she mused, that it had taken the breaking of something so fragile to release what had been held in place for so long. The human heart was not so different from her roses. One could prune and guide and bind it to trellises of etiquette and tradition. But eventually, it grew in the direction it wished to grow. And when pressed too long against silence, it either withered or burst free. Mrs. Merton, so elegant and composed, had carried a wound that never quite closed. Harold Fenchurch, ever dutiful, had spent his life shielding others from truths he himself was not permitted to speak. And poor Mr. Pettigrew, driven less by malice than by a longing to control what had once slipped through his fingers, had thought himself immune to consequence. In the end it had been Clara, the one person born without any voice in the matter, who had inherited not the estate, but the consequences of its deception. Miss Marple did not pity her. Clara, she believed, had strength of the quiet, enduring kind. The orchard, long a place of secrecy and sorrow, would now be opened again. Clara had spoken of turning it into a place for children, perhaps even a little library, a bench or two, a space for laughter and learning, and perhaps for forgetting. Though Miss Marple suspected that memory would remain, gently, like the scent of lilac after rain. As she stepped back to examine the rose bush, her cat brushed past her skirts, mewing softly. She looked down, then across the garden, her expression faintly amused. "Love and guilt," she murmured, "so often grow on the same tree." And with that, she returned to her pruning, quietly satisfied, as petals fell gently to the earth. In the weeks that followed, much dithering resumed its gentle rhythm. Morning deliveries resumed their familiar routes. The vicar's sermons returned to their dependable blend of mild exhortation and garden metaphor. The postmistress gossiped less aggressively, as if still digesting the events of recent weeks. And at Merton Lodge, the windows, long shuttered, were now opened each morning to let in the light. Clara Fenwick had decided to remain. It had not been a decision arrived at quickly, nor one made without hesitation. She had considered returning to London, its anonymity, its distractions, the comfort of a place where the past could be buried among crowds and schedules. But something had changed, not only in her understanding of what had happened, but of what could now become. Miss Marple had said once in passing that grief was not something to escape, but to repot, like a root-bound plant, long denied room to grow. Clara had remembered that, and as she walked through the orchard, now cleared of brambles, with young benches placed beneath the apple trees, and a wooden sign soon to be painted with the words, "Orchard Hollow," a place for quiet reading and play. She felt the truth of it. The orchard was no longer a secret, nor a shrine. It was a beginning. She had written to the parish council with a modest proposal, a small community garden, open to all, with a corner for children's books and storytelling on Sundays. The council, after some initial murmurs about precedent and upkeep, had agreed, helped along, no doubt, by Miss Marple's quiet endorsement and Mrs. Bantry's determined enthusiasm. There had been murmurs, of course. Some said it was improper to turn such a place into something public. Others questioned whether Clara, with her uncertain lineage and modern views, truly understood village life. But those voices had grown quieter with each week that passed. Clara's manner, respectful, restrained, and gently curious, had softened resistance. She asked after neighbors. She listened well. She declined invitations with tact and accepted advice with grace. Even the grocer, notoriously slow to warm to newcomers, began setting aside the freshest apples on Thursdays. Miss Marple, watching all of this unfold from the vantage point of quiet satisfaction, felt something deeper than pride. It was not victory she recognized, nor triumph, but a kind of healing that could not be orchestrated, only observed. The past had not been erased. It never could be. But it had been acknowledged, unearthed like the locket in the soil, and allowed to speak. And in that speaking something had been restored, not the estate, nor the family name, but something older and more lasting. Roots, after all, do not die in darkness. They wait. Clara, too, was learning to wait, not passively but with purpose. In the orchard, in the village, in her own voice, steadying now with each day. She had begun again. And as spring turned slowly toward summer, and the first children's books arrived by parcel, the orchard that had once held so much sorrow began, at last, to bloom. Some truths, it seems, wait patiently beneath the surface, tucked away in quiet corners, sealed in porcelain, buried in gardens. And when the time is right, they rise. In this tale it wasn't a grand revelation nor dramatic confession that brought justice to light, but a quiet mind, a broken sugar bowl, and the keen eye of Miss Marple. What began with a cryptic note led to a decades-old silence, finally broken, and an orchard once haunted by sorrow, now blooming again with life and laughter. There's something deeply moving in the idea that healing doesn't always come from punishment, but from truth, gently revealed. Clara did not just inherit a name, but a voice. And in reclaiming it, she chose not to repeat the past, but to replant it. But tell us, what do you think would have happened if the sugar bowl had never been broken? Would the truth have stayed hidden forever? Or do secrets, like roots? And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.